The letter was still in his hand when Lydia Bancroft walked through the door of the Sullivan Ranch house, and the moment she saw it, the world as she had understood it collapsed into a single, devastating point of clarity. It was her handwriting on the folded page, her words, her private, unguarded, foolish heart laid out in ink on paper that she had never once intended for Orville Sullivan to read. She had written that letter to her sister back in Philadelphia. She had written it in the exhausted small hours of a January night, when the Wyoming wind had been howling down from the mountains like something alive and furious, and she had been sitting alone in the cramped schoolhouse that doubled as her living quarters, and she had allowed herself to confess things she would never have spoken aloud. She had written about the rancher with the quiet eyes and the careful hands. She had written that she was afraid. She was falling in love with a man who looked right through her without ever truly seeing her. She had written that she suspected the whole enterprise of coming west to teach school had been, at its core, a secret attempt to find something she was ashamed to admit she was looking for. She had never mailed that particular letter. She had been certain of that. She had folded it, placed it beneath her pillow like a confession meant only for God and darkness, and in the morning she had written her sister a different, safer letter about the weather and the children's reading progress. And yet here was Orville Sullivan, standing in the middle of his own parlor in the last amber light of an October afternoon in 1883, holding a letter that could only have come from the cedar box beneath her cot, and his face held an expression she had never seen on it before. Not cold, not judging, something far more dangerous than either. He looked like a man who had been waiting a very long time for her to figure out something he had known for months. How long? She asked, and her voice came out wrong, too tight, too small for the size of the feeling behind it. Orville set the letter on the table between them with the deliberate care of a man who understood that the next few minutes would determine everything. Since March, he said, March, 8 months. She had been in Dry Creek, Wyoming for 10 months total, and for 8 of those months this man had known the contents of her most private thoughts. Every letter, the words felt like glass in her throat. Every one that ended up in that cedar box, he said quietly. There are 11 of them. The room went very still, except for the ticking of the mantel clock and the distant sound of cattle moving on the evening range. Lydia stood in the doorway of a house she had come to for what she had thought was an entirely practical reason, and she tried to organize the storm inside her chest into something she could survive. But before the story of how she had arrived at this shattering moment could make any sense at all, it had to begin where it truly began, on a September morning a full year before that October confrontation, when Lydia Bancroft had stepped off the southbound stage in Dry Creek with a trunk full of McGuffey readers, a certificate from the Allegheny County Normal School, and the iron determination of a woman who had decided that heartbreak in one place was no reason to stop living entirely. She had been 26 years old, and she had come west because the school board in Pittsburgh had hired a man for the position she had spent 4 years preparing for, and because her mother had spent the subsequent 3 months explaining, with loving thoroughness, that perhaps Lydia's expectations had always been slightly too large for the life available to her. And because Lydia had one morning read a notice in the back of a church newsletter about a Wyoming territory town in need of a qualified schoolteacher, and had written a letter of application before she had finished her second cup of coffee. The school board of Dry Creek, Crook County, Wyoming, had responded with enthusiasm and the promise of a salary of $40 a month, a furnished room attached to the schoolhouse, and the gratitude of a community that had gone without formal education for its children for 2 years following the departure of their previous teacher, a man named Horace Tilbert, who had apparently discovered a disinclination for frontier life somewhere around the second winter. What the notice had not mentioned, and what nobody had thought to prepare her for, was Orville Sullivan. She had met him on her second day in Dry Creek, at the general store owned by a cheerful and enormously round man named Gerald Fitch, who seemed to know everything about everyone in the territory and felt a civic responsibility to share it. Lydia had been attempting to purchase chalk and a new pen nib when the door of the store opened, and a man walked in who made the room feel somehow smaller and more significant at the same time. He was not extraordinarily tall, though he stood above average. He was perhaps 32 or 33, with the kind of weathered, deliberate face that belonged to men who spent most of their lives outside, where the sun and wind performed a slow editing of every soft feature until what remained was entirely essential. His eyes were a particular shade of gray-green, the color of sage in early morning before the heat came up, and they moved across the room in the measured way of someone accustomed to assessing situations before committing to them. He nodded to Gerald Fitch. He nodded to the two other men in the store. And then his eyes settled on Lydia for exactly 2 seconds before he looked away. But in those 2 seconds she felt with absolute unreasonable certainty that she had been seen more completely than she had been seen in a very long time. "Miss Bancroft," Gerald Fitch said with the enthusiasm of a man introducing royalty, "this here is Orville Sullivan. He runs the biggest cattle operation in this part of the county, and his 2 children, that's Clara and young Thomas, will be in your school come Monday." "Miss Bancroft," Orville Sullivan said, in a voice that was low and unhurried, and he touched the brim of his hat with 2 fingers. "Mr. Sullivan," she said, "I look forward to meeting your children." "They're looking forward to having a proper teacher again," he said. "They've been making do with whatever I can manage, and a working ranch doesn't leave a great deal of time for lessons." It was a practical statement. It contained no warmth and no coldness. It was simply the truth delivered by a man who appeared to deal in nothing else, and Lydia found it quietly devastating in a way she could not have explained. She learned the rest of it from Gerald Fitch in the subsequent 30 minutes, delivered in a cheerful, unstoppable narrative while she waited for her order to be wrapped. Orville Sullivan's wife, Margaret, had died 18 months earlier of a fever that had come on fast and gone nowhere good. She had been 29 years old and widely loved. She had left behind Clara, who was 9, and Thomas, who was 7, and a husband who had apparently not spoken an unnecessary word to anyone in the 6 months following her death, and who still, 18 months on, wore the particular stillness of a man who had relocated some essential part of himself to a place where the world could not reach it. Lydia had listened to all of this and then walked back to the schoolhouse and unpacked her trunk and told herself, with great firmness, that she had come to Wyoming to teach children and to build something of her own, and that the internal flutter she had experienced in Gerald Fitch's general store was merely the natural response of a woman who had been lonely for longer than she cared to admit. She was quite thoroughly wrong, but she did not know that yet. The school opened on the first Monday of September, and 17 children arrived in various states of readiness and reluctance, ranging in age from 6 to 14. Clara Sullivan came in with her dark braids neat, and her expression composed in a way that suggested she had learned, very young, to manage the feelings of the adults around her by presenting nothing that needed managing. Thomas Sullivan arrived 3 minutes later, running with mud on his boots and a grass stain on his elbow, and Lydia loved them both within the first hour. They were good children, smart children. Clara had a gift for arithmetic that Lydia recognized as the kind of mathematical mind that deserved more than a one-room frontier schoolhouse could offer, and Thomas had a stubbornness in reading that masked genuine curiosity, the kind that responded to the right book placed at the right moment like a key finding its lock. She kept them after school on the 3rd Friday to give Clara an additional arithmetic challenge, and to work with Thomas on a passage from a natural history book she had brought from Philadelphia. And when she looked up from the lesson, Orville Sullivan was standing in the doorway. He had come to collect his children, as he apparently always did on Fridays, when the week's work on the ranch reached a point where he could spare the hour it took to ride to town and back. He stood in the doorway of the schoolhouse for a moment, watching his daughter solve a problem on the chalkboard with the methodical confidence of someone twice her age, and then he looked at Lydia, and something moved through his expression too fast for her to name it. "She's extraordinary," Lydia said, because it was true and because she could not think of another way to begin. "She takes after her mother," he said. It was not a closed door exactly. It was more like a window that had been shuttered from the inside, and Lydia understood instinctively that pushing against it would accomplish nothing. She let it be. She talked instead about Thomas, about the natural history book, and the way the boy had lit up at a passage describing elk migration through the mountain passes, and she watched Orville Sullivan's face do something cautious and important as she spoke, something that looked like the first tentative motion of a man stepping onto ice he was not yet certain would hold him. He thanked her with the same two-word economy he appeared to apply to all social transactions. He collected his children. He rode away down the main street of Dry Creek toward the Sullivan Ranch 6 miles northeast of town, and Lydia stood in the doorway of the schoolhouse and watched the dust settle behind his horse and told herself again, with diminishing conviction, that she was here to teach school. The first letter she wrote to her sister, Catherine, arrived in Philadelphia in late September. It was a pleasant letter, descriptive and careful, full of observations about the landscape and the town and the children, and it mentioned Orville Sullivan exactly once as the father of 2 of her most promising students. The second letter, written in early October, mentioned him 3 times. By December, she was writing to Catherine with the kind of detailed attention to a single person that she was aware, even as she wrote it, constituted a symptom of something she had not entirely consented to. She wrote about the way he came to collect his children every Friday, and sometimes paused to ask about their progress, brief questions that contained an unexpected precision, an awareness of his children's specific intellectual strengths and struggles that suggested he paid close attention to things he was not present to witness. She wrote about the community social held at the church hall in November, where she had watched him stand at the edge of the room with his hat in his hands, clearly present in body and somewhere else entirely in spirit, and how he had nevertheless twice refilled her cup of cider without being asked and without drawing attention to the gesture. She wrote about the way his voice changed when he spoke to Thomas about the horses, a small but undeniable softening of the deliberate control he otherwise maintained over every syllable. She wrote in a December letter that she thought he was the loneliest man she had ever met, and that loneliness in a person of that quality felt like a specific kind of injustice. That particular letter she mailed. What she did not yet understand was that mail in Dry Creek, Wyoming, in the winter of 1882 and into 1883, was handled by a postal relay that went through the Sullivan Ranch. It was not an official arrangement. It was a practical one, grown from necessity and geography. The Sullivan Ranch sat at the intersection of 3 routes, and Orville Sullivan made a supply run to the territorial post office in Sundance every 2 weeks. The townspeople simply got into the habit of leaving their outgoing letters with Gerald Fitch, who passed them to whichever Sullivan hand was heading to the ranch, and the incoming mail came back the same way. Nobody had thought to mention this to Lydia, because it was simply how things had always worked, and everyone in Dry Creek knew it, which meant no one considered it information that required sharing. Orville Sullivan, who was a man of absolute personal honor, and who would have sooner cut off his own hand than read another person's correspondence, had discovered the situation entirely by accident. On a cold March morning, he had been sorting the mail he had collected from Sundance, separating the Dry Creek letters from the Sullivan Ranch letters, when a letter addressed to a Lydia Bancroft in Philadelphia had slipped from the stack and landed face down on his desk, and when he had picked it up the seal had come away, whether from cold or moisture, or the particular bad luck that sometimes attended a life already carrying more than its share. And the first line had been visible before he thought to look away. The first line had read, "I think I may be in love with a man who does not know I exist, and I believe I am going to have to find a way to live with that." He had not been able to look away after that. He was a man of honor, but he was also a man, and that first line had driven everything reasonable from his mind. He had read the letter. He had sat at his desk in the ranch office for a very long time afterward, and then he had carefully resealed it with fresh adhesive and sent it on to Philadelphia. He told himself it was an aberration, a single, unrepeatable failure of character. But when the next letter arrived 3 weeks later and the seal was again imperfect, a symptom of Lydia's habit of pressing too hard with her pen and cracking the wax as she wrote, he had read that one too. And the ones that did not crack, he had managed not to open. That was the truth he held on to as a small, insufficient claim to decency. He had not opened every letter, only those that came to him already compromised. Only those that had, in some fashion he chose to interpret as fate rather than weakness, already given him a window. There were, by October 1883, 11 such letters distributed across 8 months, and he had read every one of them, and every one of them had added something to the slow, complicated interior process he was undergoing, which was the process of a man who had decided, after Margaret died, that he was done with love, discovering that love had made no reciprocal commitment. The letters told him things he would never have learned from Lydia herself. They told him that she found Wyoming beautiful in a way that startled her every morning, as if she kept expecting the landscape to resolve into something more ordinary, and it kept refusing. They told him she was afraid of being ordinary herself, afraid of living a careful, small life that left no mark, afraid that her mother had been right about the size of her expectations. They told him she cried sometimes on Sunday evenings from a loneliness she could not entirely explain, since she was not an unhappy person and Dry Creek had been genuinely kind to her. They told him she thought his daughter Clara was going to do something remarkable with her mind if the world would only cooperate. They told him she was falling in love with him in the cautious, resistant way of a woman who has been disappointed before, and is extremely annoyed at herself for beginning the whole business again. And what the letters told him, cumulatively, in the layered way that only intimate and unguarded writing can convey, was that Lydia Bancroft was the most honest person he had encountered since Margaret, and that honesty in a woman, he had learned the hard way, was the single quality that undid him completely. He did not tell her he had read the letters. He understood, with crystalline clarity, that he was not entitled to the feelings the letters had given him. He had come to know her through a door she had not knowingly opened for him, and there was a specific kind of wrongness to that which he turned over in his mind on sleepless nights, examining it from every angle, looking for a way to make it clean, and not finding one. What he did instead was pay attention in a different way. He stopped merely collecting his children and leaving. He began arriving a few minutes early on Fridays and accepting, when offered, a cup of the terrible coffee that Lydia made on the small iron stove in the corner of the schoolhouse. He asked questions that were slightly longer than his questions had previously been. He repaired, without being asked, a cracked window frame in the schoolhouse that had been letting in cold air, and that Lydia had been meaning to report to the school board for 3 weeks. He did these things carefully, so carefully that a less perceptive person would not have noticed any shift at all. But Lydia Bancroft was not a less perceptive person. She noticed. She wrote about it to Catherine in a letter that went out in May, describing a change in the quality of his attention that she could not quite articulate, something that felt less like the polite interest of a parent, and more like the specific, focused awareness of a man who was deciding something important very slowly and very privately. He read that letter too, sitting alone in the ranch office at 10 o'clock on a May evening with the lamp burning low, and felt, for the first time since Margaret died, something that was not grief or obligation or the mechanical satisfaction of competent work, but something older and more frightening and more alive. The summer of 1883 changed the texture of things in Dry Creek in ways that went beyond just the two of them. There was a drought that came on hard in June and settled over the whole county like a slow catastrophe, shrinking the creek beds and cracking the range grass and driving the smaller ranchers toward decisions that had no good answers. 3 families left. 2 more were visibly struggling, and Orville Sullivan, who was not struggling in the same immediate way because the Sullivan Ranch was large enough and diversified enough to absorb a bad year, nevertheless worked from before dawn until after dark with the concentrated urgency of a man who understood that bad years had a way of becoming patterns. Lydia organized the schoolchildren into a collection drive for the hardest-hit families, gathering preserved goods and spare cloth, and a surprising quantity of useful items from the town's residents. She stayed open through July when most schools closed for harvest, because the children of struggling families had nowhere else to be, and because she had noticed, with the schoolteacher's careful eye, that 3 of her students were not eating enough. She arranged, through Gerald Fitch and without advertising it, for a standing order of bread and dried meat to be available at the schoolhouse every morning, paid for from her own salary in an amount she could barely spare. She did not tell anyone she was doing it. She told the children it was a donation from the school board, which was a lie she considered entirely justified. Orville Sullivan found out about it from Gerald Fitch in July, and the combination of admiration and something close to agony he felt on hearing it was, he recognized, the specific emotion of a man who has run out of legitimate reasons to keep his distance. He rode to the schoolhouse on a Tuesday afternoon in late July, arriving at 3 o'clock, which was not a Friday and not a time he had any customary reason to appear. Lydia was outside in the brutal heat, hanging a wet cloth over the window to cool the schoolroom, and she looked up at the sound of his horse and then looked down again, very briefly, with the expression of a woman recalibrating something fast. "I heard about the bread," he said, dismounting. "It's nothing," she said. "The school board agreed to help. Gerald Fitch told me it comes out of your salary." She turned to face him then, and he saw the flash of something in her expression, not anger exactly, but a version of it, the pride of a private person whose privacy has been quietly dissolved. "Gerald Fitch talks too much," she said. "He does," Orville agreed. "He also happens to be right about most things." There was a silence that had weight and temperature, not the comfortable silence of 2 people with nothing to say, but the charged and pressurized silence of 2 people with too much. "My children think very highly of you," he said, which was not what he had ridden out here to say, or at least was not all of it. "I think very highly of them," she said. "Clara solved a problem last week that a college student would struggle with. You should think about what she's going to need in a few years, because it would be a genuine loss if her education stopped at the edge of what this territory can offer." He was quiet for a moment. "You're the first person who's talked about her future in those terms," he said. "Someone should have been saying it since she was 6, Lydia said, with the particular directness she employed when she felt strongly about something and had stopped monitoring herself. He looked at her for a long moment in the afternoon heat, and then he said, "I'd like to bring you some supplies for that bread arrangement. Whatever you need, don't argue with me about it." She opened her mouth and then closed it. "That's generous," she said. "It's not generous," he said. "It's the right thing." He paused. "You're the only teacher this town has had in 2 years who gave a damn whether the children were fed. The least the town can do is make sure you're not paying for it alone." He rode back to the ranch and spent the evening doing exactly what he had said, and trying not to examine too carefully the fact that finding a reason to talk to her directly, without the mediation of a Friday afternoon and his children's presence, had felt like arriving somewhere after a very long journey. In August, there was a storm. It came down from the north on a Saturday night with the kind of velocity that happens in Wyoming territory and nowhere else. A wall of cold and violence that arrived without adequate warning and swept through Dry Creek, turning September into January in the space of 3 hours. By morning, the temperature had dropped 40 degrees. 3 structures in town had lost sections of roof, and the road between the ranch and town was in the kind of condition that made a 6-mile ride a serious undertaking. Lydia was fine. The schoolhouse was solidly built, and she had enough wood for the stove and enough food for several days. What she lacked, when she stepped outside Sunday morning to assess the damage, was a solution for the cracked beam in the schoolhouse roof that was now admitting a persistent cold draft through a 2-inch gap in the eastern wall. She had been considering the problem for about 20 minutes when she heard a horse. Orville Sullivan arrived with Thomas, who was now 8 and had developed a talent for making himself useful that Lydia suspected was partly an instinct for filling space that grief had emptied. They brought lumber, tools, and a pot of something hot wrapped in blankets in a saddlebag, and they spent the morning on the schoolhouse roof, while Lydia stood below, handing up boards and trying not to think about the particular angle at which the morning light was hitting the planes of Orville Sullivan's face. Thomas talked constantly, a cheerful, ranging commentary on the storm and the ranch and a coyote he had seen 3 days ago, and a book he had found in his father's study about the Lewis and Clark expedition. Orville worked in his characteristic silence, which was the silence of competence rather than indifference, the quiet of a man who does not narrate what he is doing because his hands are already speaking. When the repair was done and they climbed down and Thomas had taken the horse to the water trough, Orville stood in the schoolyard and looked at the patched wall and then at Lydia and said, "It'll hold through winter. If you hear it working loose again, send word." "I will," she said. "Thank you, both of you," he nodded. Then, with the appearance of a man who had not planned to say anything further and was saying it anyway, he said, "My sister-in-law is coming to stay with us in September. Margaret's younger sister, Eleanor. She'll be bringing her family through on their way north. I thought perhaps you might join us for supper one evening while she's here. She's a schoolteacher herself in Missouri. I think you'd find her worth talking to." It was, on its surface, a perfectly ordinary social invitation. But something in the careful way he had constructed it, the specific choice to include the information about Eleanor being a schoolteacher, as if offering Lydia a reason to accept that had nothing to do with him, made her chest ache with something she could not afford to examine too closely. "I'd like that very much," she said. Eleanor arrived in the second week of September, a warm and astute woman of 30 with 3 young children, and a frankness that Lydia appreciated enormously. And the supper Orville hosted was the first time Lydia had been inside the Sullivan Ranch house. It was a good house, large by frontier standards, built with the solidity of a man who intended things to last. The furniture was plain and well-made, and there were books on the shelves, more books than she had expected, the kind of collection that spoke of a lifelong habit rather than a social display. There was a framed photograph on the mantelpiece, a woman with dark hair and a smile that had something of Clara in its quality, composed and genuine at the same time. Lydia looked at it for only a moment, but it stayed with her all evening, not as a rival or a shadow, but as an acknowledgment of the full weight of what Orville Sullivan carried, and of the kind of woman he had loved, and of the scale of what was being asked of him by the simple fact of continuing to live. Eleanor, at some point in the evening while Orville was outside checking on a horse with Thomas, leaned across the kitchen table and said to Lydia, with the directness of a woman who has watched grief do its slow work on someone she loves, "He talks about your school, to the children, and when he doesn't think anyone is listening, to himself. I just thought you should know." Lydia had not known what to say to that. She had thanked Eleanor, which felt insufficient but was all she had. That was the evening she went home and wrote the letter she had never meant to mail, the one about being afraid she was falling in love with a man who looked right through her, the one she had placed beneath her pillow in the January dark, the one she had been absolutely certain had never left the cedar box. She had been wrong about that too. The cedar box lived under her cot, and she had, over the months, accumulated in it the letters she wrote and reconsidered and decided not to send, folding them neatly and placing them in the box as a kind of private record, a journal in letter form. She had kept perhaps 15 such unsent letters over the course of the year. The problem, which she had not known and which could not have been anticipated, was that she kept her sent letters and her unsent letters in the same box, separated only by habit and an assumption of privacy that the geography of Dry Creek had quietly rendered obsolete. In March, when she had been gathering her mail to send it out, she had accidentally included one of the unsent letters in the bundle. She had been tired, and the letter was addressed and sealed, because she had a habit of sealing letters even when she had not yet decided whether to send them. She had not noticed the error. Orville Sullivan had picked up that bundle 2 days later from Gerald Fitch, and when the seal on one letter had come away in his hands, he had found himself reading words that Lydia had written in the deliberate privacy of an unsent letter, which meant they were rawer and more unguarded than anything she had chosen to send. Then, because the universe has a particular interest in thoroughness, the same thing had happened again and again. Because Lydia was a writer who pressed too hard and sealed too warm and kept her sent and unsent correspondence in the same cedar box, and trusted, without verification, that the arrangement she had been told about for outgoing mail was operating with more precision than it actually was. In the end, there were 11 compromised letters, of which 7 were letters she had never intended to send at all. Orville Sullivan had read every one of them, and he had not said a word. That was the situation Lydia walked into on that October afternoon, when she had come to the ranch house on perfectly innocent business, a question about the upcoming school board meeting, and whether the board intended to fund a new slate of readers for the younger students. And she had knocked on the open door and stepped into the parlor and found Orville Sullivan standing with a letter in his hand, and the look on his face of a man who has been carrying a secret for so long that it has become load-bearing. The letter on the table between them was the January letter, the one she had been most certain had never left the cedar box, the one about being afraid she was falling in love. She recognized her own handwriting with the particular horror of seeing your own private thoughts rendered suddenly, permanently visible. 8 months, she said again, still processing the number. I want to explain, he said. I want you to try, she said, and her voice had found something steadier, not cold, not warm, but exact, the voice of a woman who needs the truth and is fully prepared to survive whatever it turns out to be. He told her everything. He stood in his own parlor and told her about the first letter, about the seal giving way in his hands in March, about the single line that had stopped him before he could look away. He told her about the choice he had made, which he did not defend, to read the letter to its end. He told her about the subsequent letters, the ones with cracked seals, which he now understood must have been a combination of her wax technique and the dry winter air. He told her about the ones he had not read, the ones whose seals were intact, which he had forwarded directly. He told her about what the letters had done to him over the course of 8 months, which was to dismantle, slowly, and without his full consent, a decision he had made in the raw weeks after Margaret's death to close that particular room in himself permanently. He told her all of this with the steady, deliberate honesty of a man who has spent a great deal of time deciding how to tell the truth about something he is not proud of. I should have told you immediately, he said when he had finished. The first time, I should have come to you the next day and handed you the letter and told you what had happened and apologized. There is no good reason why I didn't. There are reasons, but none of them are good enough. What are the reasons? She asked. He was quiet for a moment. I was afraid, he said, in the voice of a man for whom that admission is not small. I was afraid that telling you would mean talking about what I'd read, and talking about what I'd read would mean acknowledging what it had done to me, and I was not ready to do that. What had it done to you? She asked. He looked at her with those gray-green eyes that she had been writing about to her sister for a year, and said, with the complete simplicity of a man who has given up on careful management, it made me want to stay. The room was very quiet. You already live here, Lydia said, because she was not a woman who let precision slide even in the middle of emotional catastrophe. "I mean in it," he said, "in the living of things. I've been going through the motions of running the ranch and raising my children and being present in my body without being present anywhere else. And your letters, which I had no right to and no excuse for reading, kept showing me someone who was all the way in, who was paying attention to everything, who was afraid but was doing it anyway. And it reminded me that it was possible to be that way. I'd forgotten that it was possible." Lydia looked at the letter on the table between them. She looked at the man across from it. She thought about 11 letters, about 8 months, about the window repairs and the August storm and the July heat, and a year of Friday afternoons, and the steady, careful accumulation of a feeling she had been arguing with since the day she first walked into Gerald Fitch's store. She thought about the fact that he had read her most unguarded, private thoughts and had not once used them to diminish her, had not once let on that he knew, had only used what he had read to move toward her in the slow, careful way of a man who understood that what he was being given had not been meant for him and was treating it accordingly. "You used what you knew," she said slowly, working it out. "To be kinder, to be more present, to make room." "Yes," he said, "that's not the same as using it against me." "No," he agreed, "but it's not the same as earning the right to know it either." She picked up the letter from the table. She looked at her own handwriting for a moment, then set it down again. "Orville," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name without the architecture of formal address around it, and he went very still. "If you had come to me in March," she said, "and told me what had happened and apologized, I would have been mortified and I would have left Dry Creek before the end of the week." He waited. "I am telling you that not to excuse what you did," she said, "but because the terrifying thing is that I don't think it would have been better. I think we needed this whole year. I think I needed to become the person who could be in this room without running away, and I don't know if I was that person in March." "And now?" he asked, in a voice she had never heard him use before, stripped of all the careful management. "Now I am standing here," she said, "which is either very brave or very foolish, and I have genuinely never been able to tell the difference." He took 3 steps around the table, not fast, not slow, the deliberate movement of a man who does nothing by accident, and he stopped close enough that she could see the specific way the afternoon light changed the color of his eyes, and he said, "I would like very much to stop doing things I have to apologize for." "That seems like a reasonable goal," she said, and her voice was not quite steady. "I'd like to court you," he said, "properly. With your knowledge and your consent and no more letters I haven't been given the right to read. I think," Lydia said carefully, "that if you would like to know what I'm thinking, you could simply ask me." "I'm asking now," he said. She looked up at him for a long moment. Outside, through the parlor window, the last of the October sun was touching the Wyoming range with that particular gold that she had been failing to adequately describe in letters for over a year. The cattle were moving on the evening pasture. Somewhere distant, Thomas was almost certainly doing something inadvisable, and Clara was almost certainly aware of it and tracking it with the patient precision of an older sister. "I think," Lydia said, "that I have been in love with you for approximately 9 months, and it has been exhausting, and I would be very glad to stop managing it alone." The thing that happened in Orville Sullivan's face at that moment was something she catalogued immediately and completely, because she was a woman who paid attention to everything, and what she saw was not triumph or relief, but something much quieter and more specific than either. It was the expression of a man who has been in the cold for a very long time and has just stepped inside. He did not kiss her, not then. He was not that kind of man, the kind who moved without deliberation, and they were standing in his parlor on a Tuesday afternoon, and his children would be coming in from the barn within the hour. What he did was reach out and take her hand in both of his, with the careful steadiness he brought to everything, and hold it for a moment in the serious, attentive way of a man making a commitment at the cellular level. "I owe you something," he said. "What?" "All the things I would have said if I'd had the right to be saying them. I'd like to earn the right to say them now." "You have a great deal of time in which to do that," she said. He smiled, and it was the first time she had seen him genuinely smile, not the polite acknowledgement he produced at social occasions, but a real smile, one that involved his whole face and changed the quality of the room. It was, she thought, worth all 11 letters. The formal courtship of Lydia Bancroft and Orville Sullivan was, by the standards of Dry Creek, Wyoming in the fall of 1883, both entirely conventional and an object of considerable town interest. Orville came to the schoolhouse on Friday afternoons and drank her terrible coffee and stayed longer than the purpose of collecting his children required. He invited her to Sunday dinner at the ranch, with a frequency that escalated from occasional to habitual over the course of October and November. He wrote her a letter, which he gave directly to her hand rather than routing it through any postal system, in early November, which was 2 pages of his direct and careful handwriting, and which she read sitting in the schoolhouse at 9 in the evening with her heart performing various structural compromises. He had written about Margaret, not as a confession or an apology, but as a piece of truth he wanted her to have properly, through her own eyes rather than through the second-hand filter of Gerald Fitch's warm-hearted and imprecise narration. He wrote about who Margaret had been, her humor and her stubbornness and the particular way she had of making things feel possible, and about the 2 years since she died, and what it had been like to keep the ranch and the children and himself going in the absence of the person who had made him understand why all of it was worth the effort. He wrote that he had not thought he would find another person capable of making him understand that again. He wrote that he had been wrong about this, and that being wrong had never felt like less of a failure. He wrote, at the very end of the letter, that he found her extraordinary, and had found her so from approximately the 2nd Friday of September 1882, and that the only reason he had not said so sooner was that he had needed to be sure he was offering her something real rather than the desperation of a lonely man, and that he was now sure. Lydia read this letter 3 times and then wrote him back. In a letter she gave him directly the following Friday, telling him things she had previously only committed to the private record of the cedar box. She wrote about Pittsburgh and the job she had not been given, and her mother's careful explanations of the appropriate dimensions of a woman's ambitions. She wrote about why she had come west, not just the practical reasons but the deeper, less admissible ones, the sense that she had been waiting her entire life to become someone she could not yet see but suspected was possible, and that Wyoming had, against all reasonable expectation, been the place where that person had started to appear. She wrote that she thought a man who could raise 2 children like Clara and Thomas, with that combination of self-possession and genuine warmth and intellectual hunger, was doing something profound, and that she hoped he knew it. She wrote that she was not afraid anymore, which was not entirely true but was true enough to write down. The children knew, of course. Children always know. Clara had been tracking the situation with her characteristic composure and precision since approximately September, and in early November she asked her father, in the direct way she had, whether Miss Bancroft was going to be a permanent fixture of their Sundays. Orville had told her with equal directness that he was working on it. Clara had nodded, with the air of someone who has been managing a project and is being informed that the expected outcome is tracking as predicted. "Good," she had said. "She told me last week that there are female mathematicians at universities in the East, and she gave me a book about one of them. I would like her to keep doing things like that." Thomas's response, when his father raised the subject with him a day later, was immediate and enthusiastic. "Can we teach her to ride properly?" he asked. "She holds the reins wrong." Lydia was, in fact, a perfectly adequate rider, but she accepted this assessment with grace and allowed Thomas to spend 3 Saturday afternoons providing instruction with the earnestness of an 8-year-old who has found a calling. By December, the whole of Dry Creek had formed a collective opinion that the situation was progressing satisfactorily, and Gerald Fitch had been heard to remark to anyone who would listen that he had seen it coming since the very first day, which was entirely false but forgivable given his general enthusiasm for the story. It was on a December evening, when the first real snow of the season had come down and made the world outside the Sullivan Ranch house silent and white and enormous, and the four of them were sitting around the parlor fire, Clara working at her arithmetic and Thomas reading the Lewis and Clark book for the third time, and Orville and Lydia sitting across from each other at the table with the remains of supper between them, and a conversation that had been going for 2 hours without once running dry. That Orville Sullivan reached into his desk drawer and placed on the table between them a small cedar box. It was not the cedar box from the schoolhouse, but it was the same dimensions, the same plain, honest carpentry. Inside it, when Lydia opened it, were 11 folded letters. "I want you to have them back," he said. "All of them. They were always yours." She looked at the letters for a long moment, then she looked at him. "Have you memorized them?" she asked. "Most of them," he said without apology. She closed the box. "Then having them back is largely symbolic." "Yes," he said, "but symbols matter." She kept the box. She put it back in her own cedar chest when she returned to the schoolhouse that night, and she sat with it for a while in the dark, thinking about the strange and unlikely road that 2 private and somewhat stubborn people had traveled to arrive at where they currently were, and she found that she could not locate anything about it that she wished had been different. In January of 1884, on a Sunday evening when the temperature was 15 below, and the stars over Wyoming were the hard, particular stars of deep winter, Orville Sullivan asked Lydia Bancroft to marry him. He did it simply, as he did everything. They had been sitting on the front porch of the ranch house despite the cold, because Lydia had wanted to see the stars and Orville had wrapped her in a heavy blanket and sat beside her, and they had been talking about nothing specific, just the comfortable ranging talk of 2 people who have run out of necessary things to say and have arrived at the pleasure of saying unnecessary things. And he had stopped in the middle of a sentence and looked at her and said, "I want to marry you. I think you know that. I'm asking you directly so you can answer directly." "Yes," she said, without hesitation, which was the only answer she had ever had. He put his arm around her shoulders, and they sat on the porch in the January cold and looked at the winter stars over the Wyoming range. And it was not romantic in any way that a novel would have described as romantic. And it was the most romantic thing that had ever happened to Lydia Bancroft in her 27 years on Earth. They were married in March of 1884 in the church at Dry Creek, which was packed to capacity because the whole town had, by this point, developed a proprietary interest in the outcome. Eleanor came back from Missouri for the occasion, and she sat in the front row with Clara, who was wearing her braids up for the first time and carrying herself with the specific dignity of someone who has been correct about something important. Thomas wore a new shirt and managed to keep it clean for the full duration of the ceremony, which Lydia later described as his finest achievement of the year. The wedding was performed by the Reverend James Polk, who was a young man from Ohio with an earnest manner and a tendency to address the congregation as if they required encouragement to exist, and the vows were the traditional ones, which felt entirely adequate to what was actually happening between Lydia Bancroft and Orville Sullivan, because what was actually happening was the specific, hard-won, clear-eyed love of 2 people who had seen each other's most private faces and decided, with full information and complete awareness of the cost, to show up anyway. Gerald Fitch cried. He would later maintain to anyone who questioned this that he had something in his eye. The Sullivan Ranch became Lydia's home in the way that places become home when you have been looking for them for a long time and have not known you were looking. She kept the school because she was not a woman who abandoned obligations, and because she loved the work, and because the children of Dry Creek deserved consistency, and she had a gift for giving it to them. Orville never once suggested she should stop, which she noticed and was grateful for, and which she recorded in a letter to her sister Catherine in April of 1884, as possibly the thing she loved most about him, that he understood her work as fully her own. She did write to Catherine, of course, with great regularity. And those letters she now mailed through the proper postal channels in Sundance, which Orville drove them to himself every 2 weeks on the supply run, and he did not read them, and she trusted this completely, and this too was a form of love. The spring of 1884 was wet and generous after the drought year, and the ranch recovered quickly, and the mood in Dry Creek was the cautious optimism of people who have survived something and are allowing themselves, carefully, to believe the worst is past. In May, Clara placed first in a territory-wide arithmetic competition that Lydia had entered her in through a contact at the normal school in Cheyenne, competing against students from schools across Wyoming, and winning by a margin that left the judges writing polite letters of inquiry about her training. Clara received this news with the composure of someone who had expected it, and then went quietly to her room for 20 minutes, and when she came out her eyes were slightly red, and she did not comment on this and neither did anyone else. But at supper she looked at Lydia and said, "Thank you for knowing," and Lydia had to concentrate very hard on her plate for a moment. Thomas, for his part, had discovered a profound interest in the natural sciences that had expanded from elk migration to encompass geology, botany, and a highly inconvenient enthusiasm for the collection of live specimens. And by the summer of 1884 the Sullivan Ranch had, in a corner of the barn that Thomas had claimed by squatters' rights, a rotating population of insects, small reptiles, and one extremely patient toad named President Arthur. Orville bore all of this with the equanimity of a man who has decided that a full and complicated house is preferable in every way to a quiet and empty one. In the late summer of 1884, Lydia told Orville she was expecting a child. She told him on a quiet Tuesday evening in the ranch kitchen, straightforwardly, in the direct manner she had come to understand was the only register he fully trusted, and she watched his face move through several distinct expressions in rapid succession, none of which he attempted to conceal. The last of these was something open and unguarded and enormous, and he put his hands on her face and kissed her forehead, and then stood with his forehead against hers for a long moment without speaking. "Are you all right?" he said finally, in the low voice she had come to identify as the one reserved for things that mattered most. "More than all right," she said. "Good," he said. And then, after a pause, "Good." Clara, informed the following day, conducted a brief and methodical assessment of what this development would mean for the household's organization, and concluded that it was manageable and that she would help. Thomas immediately began discussing names, none of which were suitable, with great enthusiasm. The process of negotiation took several weeks. The child was born in April of 1885, in the wide upstairs bedroom of the Sullivan Ranch house, attended by the town's doctor, and by a capable woman named Ada Reyes, who had served as midwife for most of Dry Creek's children, and who had the calm efficiency of someone for whom birth was simply the most consequential ordinary thing in the world. Orville was downstairs, engaged in the time-honored tradition of people who are not permitted in the room waiting by doing nothing useful with great intensity, while Clara sat in the kitchen with her arithmetic book open in front of her, not reading it, and Thomas built and dismantled a tower of dominoes approximately 15 times. The child was a boy. They named him James, after no one in particular, but because it was a good solid name that did not ask too much of itself. Orville came upstairs when Ada opened the door, and he stood for a moment in the doorway of the bedroom looking at his wife holding their son, and his face did the thing it had done in the parlor on that October afternoon, the expression of a man who has come in from the cold. He crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at James with the particular focused attention he brought to important things, and then he looked at Lydia, who was tired and radiant in the specific way of women who have done something enormous and are still in the middle of knowing it. "He has your stubbornness," she said. "He absolutely refused to cooperate with the schedule." "He has your curiosity," Orville said. "He came out already looking at everything." Clara and Thomas were brought up from the kitchen, and Clara held her half-brother with the careful competence of a girl who had been paying attention her whole life. And Thomas, who had been lobbying for the name Charles Darwin Sullivan without success, studied James with the concentrated interest of a junior naturalist encountering a new specimen, and announced that he was going to be the best possible big brother, which turned out to be entirely true. James learned to walk in the autumn of 1885, careening around the ranch house in the specific way of children who have been fully mobile inside their own bodies for months and cannot understand why the outside world does not move as fast. He inherited his father's gray-green eyes and his mother's verbal abundance, and by the time he was 2, he was conducting negotiations with a fluency that delighted Lydia and mildly alarmed Orville, who recognized the combination of his wife's precision and his own stubbornness, and understood that they had created something formidable. In the spring of 1886, a letter arrived from a university in Philadelphia, addressed to Clara Sullivan, in response to an inquiry that Lydia had made 6 months earlier on Clara's behalf, describing the programs available to women of exceptional mathematical ability and the mechanisms by which a girl in Wyoming territory might prepare herself to pursue them. The letter was encouraging and specific and contained the name of a preparatory school in Cheyenne that had in recent years begun accepting a small number of female students for advanced study. Clara read the letter twice at the kitchen table, her face doing something complex and slow, and then she looked at her father and her stepmother and said, "I want to go." Orville was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I know." "It would mean leaving the ranch," Clara said, with the careful precision of a girl who understands that information needs to be laid flat on the table before decisions can be made. "I know that too," he said. "I'd come back," she said. "For holidays. For the important things. We'll figure it out," he said. Lydia, watching this exchange, thought about all the ways the world constrains women of ability, and all the ways it sometimes, imperfectly, opens. She thought about her own mother's careful management of her expectations, and the church newsletter, and the westbound stage, and the morning in Gerald Fitch's store when a man with gray-green eyes had looked at her for exactly 2 seconds and changed the whole story. "You'll go in September," she told Clara, "and you'll write to us every week, and you'll be remarkable, and we will be completely insufferable about it to everyone we know." Clara's composure lasted approximately 3 more seconds, and then she crossed the kitchen and hugged Lydia with the full force of a 13-year-old, who has been composing herself for years and has just been given permission to stop. The summer of 1886 was hot and long and good. Thomas, who was 11, had developed a friendship with the son of a Lakota family living on the northern edge of the county, a boy named Running Fox, whose father had been a renowned hunter and who shared Thomas's encyclopedic interest in the natural world. The friendship was not without its complications, and Orville had more than one conversation in town about the propriety of it that he ended by suggesting, with his characteristic economy, that the speaker mind their own business, and that the Sullivan Ranch welcomed who the Sullivan family chose to welcome. Lydia approved of this position vigorously. She also quietly expanded the school's library to include histories that did not omit or sanitize the realities of what had happened in the territories to the peoples who had lived there, and she had several pointed conversations with the school board about it, which she won, because she had by 1886 developed a reputation for the specific brand of persistence that made opposition more exhausting than agreement. Thomas and Running Fox spent 2 weeks that summer mapping the creek beds north of the ranch and cataloging every living thing they found in them, and the resulting document, written in Thomas's cramped, enthusiastic hand and illustrated by Running Fox with a precision that suggested a genuine artistic gift, was the most complete natural survey of that particular stretch of Wyoming that had ever been produced by anyone, let alone two 11-year-olds. Lydia had it bound. In September, Clara departed for Cheyenne on the stage, with a trunk packed with the care that she brought to all logistical matters and her arithmetic books in a separate bag she carried herself, because she was taking no chances with the arithmetic books. She hugged Thomas, who was attempting a stoic expression and not entirely achieving it. She hugged James, who was too and completely uncertain about what was happening. She hugged her father for a long time and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that their whole life together had not already said. And then she hugged Lydia, who had been her teacher before she was anything else, and she said quietly into Lydia's shoulder, "You came at exactly the right time." Lydia held on a moment longer. "So did you," she said. After the stage left and the dust settled on the main street of Dry Creek, Orville stood beside Lydia in the September morning and did not attempt to manage his expression, and she took his hand and held it, and they stood there together until they were ready to move. Life on the Sullivan Ranch continued in the full, complicated, mostly joyful way of lives that have been honestly lived. James grew into a boy of remarkable determination, and his mother's linguistic fluency and his father's habit of watching situations carefully before entering them, which turned out to be a potent combination. Thomas prepared, at the age of 15, to travel to Cheyenne himself, following Clara's path to the preparatory school, having declared an intention to pursue natural science that no one who had met him at age 8 found even slightly surprising. Lydia continued to teach at the Dry Creek School, and the school grew as the town grew, and she lobbied for and eventually obtained a second teacher, a young woman from Kansas named Ruth Ellis, who arrived in 1887 with the same combination of determination and secret terror that Lydia recognized from her own arrival 5 years earlier, and she took Ruth under her protection with the warmth of someone who remembers vividly what it is like to need it. Letters still traveled through the Sullivan Ranch on the postal relay. Lydia was now fully aware of this arrangement and thought nothing of it, because there was nothing she wrote that she would not have given Orville directly, and there was nothing Orville would have read that was not his to know. The cedar box still sat on the shelf in their bedroom, containing 11 letters in her handwriting and 1 letter in his, the November letter that had begun the real conversation, and occasionally one of them would take it out and read from it, not from nostalgia exactly, but from the specific pleasure of being able to trace the exact geography of how you arrived somewhere good. Gerald Fitch, who had been right about everything since the beginning and was only growing more vocal about it with age, organized a 5th anniversary celebration for the Sullivan wedding in March of 1889 that the whole town attended, and that involved a quantity of food and music disproportionate to any ordinary occasion, and during which he gave a speech that Lydia privately considered 10 minutes too long but which contained, buried in its rambling enthusiasm, the accurate observation that some stories, told plainly, were worth the telling. In June of 1889, Lydia told Orville she was expecting their second child. He received this news in the same way he had received the first, with the careful fullness of a man who does not waste the important moments, and he held her in the kitchen in the early morning light and said, "James is going to be extremely opinionated about this." "James is extremely opinionated about everything," she said. "He gets it from his mother. He absolutely gets it from his father," she said, and felt him laugh against her hair. The second child was born in February of 1890, another boy, who arrived into the Wyoming winter with a healthy set of lungs and an immediate, impassioned objection to the cold. They named him Robert, and James, who was 4, greeted his brother with the regal generosity of a child who has been prepared for an arrival and has decided to make the best of it, and within a week had appointed himself Robert's primary advocate in all matters. Orville's ranch continued to grow and diversify through the late 1880s and into the 1890s, adding a second hay operation and a small apple orchard that had no business surviving Wyoming winters but obstinately persisted, much like its planter. The house was expanded twice, once in 1887 when it became clear that the upstairs needed more rooms, and once in 1891 when Lydia said, with complete reasonableness, that a house this well-used deserved a proper parlor with a proper bookshelf, and Orville spent 3 weeks building her one. Clara came back from Cheyenne in 1890, having exhausted what the preparatory school could offer her, and having been accepted, through Lydia's correspondence and her own remarkable test results, to a women's college in the East that had a mathematics department of genuine distinction. She was 16, and her composure was exactly what it had always been, but there was something behind it now that had fully come into its own, a confidence that was not performed but inhabited. She spent a month at the ranch before departing east, and during that month she tutored James in arithmetic with the patient thoroughness of someone who had learned from the best, and she spent long evenings in the parlor talking with Lydia and Orville about mathematics and books and the future, and she helped Thomas pack for Cheyenne, and she held Robert with the careful ease of an older sister who has always been good with small things. On the evening before she left for the East, she sat with Orville on the front porch in the summer dark, just the two of them, while Lydia put the boys to bed, and she said to her father in the quiet, direct way that was entirely her mother's and entirely her own, "Are you happy?" Orville considered this question with the seriousness it deserved. "Yes," he said. "Good," Clara said. "I worried for a while after Mother died. I worried for a long time." "I know you did," he said. "I'm sorry it was a weight you had to carry." "It wasn't a weight," she said. "I just wanted it to come right." She was quiet for a moment. "Lydia makes it right, not the same as before, differently, but right." "Yes," he said. "She does." Clara left the next morning, and the house was quieter for her absence, but it was the good kind of quiet that belongs to a thing that has gone well rather than the hollow kind that belongs to a thing that has been lost. Lydia stood on the porch and watched the stage disappear down the road toward the east and thought, with the specific gratitude of a woman who has been paying attention her whole life, about the distance between the person who had stepped off a stage in Dry Creek in September of 1882, alone and determined and honestly terrified, and the person standing on this porch now. In this life that had been assembled from a church newsletter and a cracked wax seal and 11 letters, and a man with gray-green eyes who had needed reminding that it was possible to stay. The distance was not measurable in miles or years. It was measurable in Friday afternoons and coffee drunk in a one-room schoolhouse and a cracked window repaired, and a porch in January cold, and a Sunday when the stage left and someone was there to hold your hand in the dust until you were ready to move. Thomas came home from Cheyenne the same year Clara left for the East, having thoroughly satisfied the preparatory school's requirements, and having arranged, through a correspondence with a professor at Yale who had received a copy of the Creek Survey, to study natural science at a level that made Gerald Fitch deliver a speech at the general store about the Sullivan family that lasted considerably longer than anyone had planned for. Thomas was 15 and lanky and still enthusiastic about everything, and he brought Running Fox's younger brother to the ranch for a week that summer, a quiet boy named Sky Overwater who had Running Fox's father's gift for observation, and who said very little but noticed everything. And Lydia taught both boys from the same natural science books with the same care she brought to all of it, because a classroom was wherever learning was happening, and she had never believed otherwise. The years settled into themselves with the graceful accumulation of a life well made. Robert grew from a loud and opinionated infant into a loud and opinionated child, who had inherited the best and most exhausting qualities of both his parents and who was, at age 5, already conducting what could only be described as philosophical arguments with the ranch dogs. James, at 9, was Clara in mathematical miniature, and Lydia had already begun the same quiet campaign she had conducted for Clara. The letters, the contacts, the competitions entered, the future mapped with care. In the spring of 1895, a letter arrived from Philadelphia. It was from Catherine, Lydia's sister, the woman who had received 11 letters from a Wyoming schoolteacher over the course of a year, the woman who had read the contents of her sister's private heart without ever once knowing that those contents had also been read by the man they were about, and who had been the faithful, beloved recipient of every version of this story from its beginning. Catherine was coming west. She had married in 1886, a good man named Frederick who ran a printing firm, and they had 2 children, and Frederick had been offered a position in Denver that he intended to accept, and the route west went through Wyoming territory, and Catherine Sullivan, née Bancroft, had not seen her sister in 13 years. The news arrived on a Tuesday, and Lydia read the letter standing at the kitchen table and then sat down hard in the nearest chair, and Orville, who had been at the stove, turned to look at her with the alert, quiet attention he gave to changes in her expression, and she said, "Catherine is coming." He came to the table and sat across from her. "When?" "September." "Good," he said. "She's never met you," Lydia said. "She's only read about you." "I know something about that," he said, with the small, careful smile that had been one of the revelations of their marriage, the extent of his humor, which was entirely dry and entirely genuine, and had been there all along beneath the careful management. Lydia laughed, and the laugh ran through the kitchen like the first thing in the world. Catherine arrived in September of 1895 on a day of extraordinary golden light, when Wyoming was performing its autumn best with the focused intensity of a landscape that knows it only has 6 weeks before winter closes everything down. She stepped off the stage in Dry Creek, and she and Lydia stood on the main street and held each other for a long time while Frederick stood back with the children and pretended to be interested in the architecture. That evening, at the Sullivan Ranch, Catherine sat across the supper table from Orville Sullivan and studied him with the frank and methodical attention of a woman who has read a great deal about a person and is now applying reality to prediction. Orville endured this with his characteristic equanimity. Later, when Lydia was putting Robert to bed and Orville had taken Frederick to see the horses, Catherine sat with James at the kitchen table, and James, who was 9 and had inherited his mother's precision and his father's directness, looked at his aunt with the expression of a child who senses a useful conversation and said, "Did you know my father a long time ago?" "I knew about him a long time ago," Catherine said. "That's different," James said, with 9-year-old accuracy. "It is," she agreed. "But sometimes knowing about someone first is how you learn to recognize them when you meet them." James considered this. "Is that what happened with my mother and father?" Catherine thought about 11 letters and a cracked wax seal and the particular mercy of the universe which sometimes allows the wrong things to produce the right outcomes. "Something like that," she said. James nodded, satisfied, and went back to his arithmetic. Later that night, when the children were in bed and Frederick was asleep in the guest room, and the ranch house was quiet with the deep quiet of late September, Catherine sat on the front porch with Lydia and Orville under the Wyoming stars, and she said, at some point in the long and easy conversation, "I read every one of those letters you wrote me, Lydia. I knew how this was going to end before you did." "I knew too," Lydia said. "I just wasn't admitting it." "Did you know?" Catherine asked Orville. He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the dark range where the cattle moved like slow, distant shapes in the starlight. "I knew something was possible," he said. "I didn't know if we'd make it to possible." "And now?" Catherine asked. He looked at Lydia, and she looked back at him, and the thing between them was not the first electricity of a new feeling but something that had been tested by weather and silence and honest conversation and the ordinary accumulation of years, and was the stronger for all of it. "Now we're past possible," he said simply. Catherine left after 2 weeks, bound for Denver with Frederick and the children, and she hugged Lydia on the main street of Dry Creek with the completeness of 13 years of letters finally given a body. And she shook Orville's hand and held it an extra moment and said, "You're exactly as described." And he said, "I hope that's a good thing." And she said, "It is," and meant it entirely. The years continued on in the way of good years, which is to say full and various, and not without difficulty, but essentially oriented in the right direction. Clara wrote every month from the East, where she was making her mark in the way that remarkable women make their marks, persistently and against resistance, and without any intention of stopping. She had begun corresponding with other female mathematicians, and had written a paper that was published in 1896 in a journal that Lydia framed and hung in the parlor to the mild embarrassment of everyone except Clara, who said nothing about the framing but noticed it every time she came home. Thomas returned from Yale in 1897 with a degree in natural sciences and an ambition to produce the definitive natural history of the Wyoming Territory, and he set about doing exactly that, based at the Sullivan Ranch, making periodic expeditions with Running Fox's younger brother Sky Overwater, who had become, in the years since that summer visit, a partner in the project and a close friend. Their work together would eventually produce a document of genuine scientific importance, but that was still ahead of them in 1897, and what Thomas had currently was enthusiasm, field notebooks, and President Arthur's great-great-great-grandchild in the barn, which meant some things did not change. James, at 11, was preparing to follow Clara and Thomas to Cheyenne, and Robert, at 7, was loudly indignant about being left behind, and the Sullivan Ranch house in the autumn of 1897 contained the specific, beloved chaos of a family that had been thoroughly assembled from all its various pieces and was entirely, irrevocably itself. On an October evening in 1897, exactly 14 years after that afternoon in the parlor, when a letter on a table between two people had changed everything, Lydia Bancroft Sullivan sat on the front porch of the ranch house in the October dark and looked out at the Wyoming range. The sky was the particular black-blue of October nights in the high country, and the stars were the hard winter stars beginning their return, and the cattle were somewhere out on the range making their peaceful nighttime sounds, and from inside the house came the sounds of Robert's monologue addressed to anyone who would listen, and Thomas's patient response and Orville's low voice saying something she could not quite hear. She had a letter on her lap, not a letter to send, and not a letter to hide in a cedar box. It was a letter she had written earlier that evening, addressed to no one in particular, because she had reached the point in her life where she sometimes wrote to the air itself, to the accumulation of years, to the specific geography of how you arrive at the place you were always going. The letter said something simple. It said that she had come to Wyoming Territory in 1882 with a trunk full of McGuffey readers, and the determination of a woman who had decided that heartbreak in one place was no reason to stop living entirely, and she had found in the implausible fact of this life, this man, these children, this range of impossible stars, the answer to a question she had not known she was asking. The question was whether it was possible to be fully known and fully loved, not the performance of yourself that you offer to the world, but the actual, unguarded, privately acknowledged interior person who writes unsent letters in the dark and cries on Sunday evenings from a loneliness she cannot explain and harbors expectations that are larger than what is ordinarily available. The answer, delivered via cracked wax seal and 11 letters, and 14 years of the most honest life she had ever witnessed at close range, was yes. Orville came out onto the porch and sat beside her and looked at the stars and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that the sitting together did not already say, and she folded the letter and put it in her pocket and leaned against his shoulder, and the Wyoming night closed around them both, full and familiar and wide as the sky itself, which was the exact size of everything they had built together. Inside, Robert was explaining something important to Thomas about the correct classification of President Arthur's great-great-great-grandchild, and James was doing his arithmetic, and somewhere in the East Clara was working a problem that no one had solved yet. And in Cheyenne Thomas's college notebooks were stacked on the shelf in his old room waiting for the next expedition. And in a cedar box on the bedroom shelf were 11 letters and a November morning, and the whole implausible beginning of the story. And on the porch of the Sullivan Ranch on an October night in 1897, Lydia Bancroft Sullivan and Orville Sullivan sat together in the dark and watched the stars and were, simply and enormously, and without any reservation at all, home.